So I'm Antoine Jolme. I'm a consultant in business ethics in Paris, France, and I'm looking after this work of initiatives of change on business and economy. And we've started already almost 2 years ago now to have a series of meetings on the implications of sustainability for businesses and for ourselves. And I must say that the theme that we are going to deal with today is very much a hot topic, as what we've heard since we started is a lot of very promising efforts, a lot of very good initiatives, but at the same time, there is the question of the resistance, people who resist the ideas of social and environmental responsibility for companies, and people who fight against it. And to me today, it's not clear whether this fight will be won and by whom. So I'm very eager to hear the insights of Mark. But before he speaks, I'd like to introduce Mike Smith, who is a journalist from Britain, who would like to give a few words of introduction to Mark.
Well, many thanks, Antoine. Can you see me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Good. Well, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Mark to everyone, whom I have known for a number of years. We first met through a mutual friend, the late Anant Nadkarni from the Tata Corporation in India. And Mark is the founder and CEO of Tomorrow's Company think tank in London, having spent more than a decade in industry. And he calls it actually a think and do tank, because they're not just talking theoretically, but how do you apply ethical values in practice? And Mark is the author of 2 books. His first book was called Living Tomorrow's Company, published in 1998. And he came at my invitation to speak to the International Business Forum in Co in Switzerland, the Initiatives of Change Center there, launched his book there. And then when the Indian edition of his book was published, he came to the Initiatives of Change Center in Panchgani, hill resort south of Pune. And he launched the Indian edition of his book, Living Tomorrow's Company, at that conference in Panchgani. And his latest book is called Entrusted, Stewardship Responsible for Business, which he's the co-author of. It's published this year. His co-author is Boon Huiyan, who I believe is from Singapore. That has just come out this year. So I'm delighted to hand over to Mark, and very grateful, Mark, that you've accepted to address our webinar today. Over to you.
Mike, thank you very much indeed, and it's lovely to be working once again with Initiatives of Change and with yourself and with Antoine. One small correction: I'm quite relieved to say that I'm no longer the CEO of Tomorrow's Company. In the audience today is John Maguire, who is leading Tomorrow's Company's new work, which is focused on how people learn about business based upon our concerns that a completely distorted view of business has been allowed to embed itself in the assumptions of education. And we started at the University of East Anglia with a program we've been running for all the business students there. But John is now taking that work into schools as well. And if you want to know more about it, do email John Maguire at Tomorrow's Company or contact me. So with that aside, thank you for the welcome. Let me explain why it is that I believe there is cause for concern about whether ESG can deliver. And to start my argument, I want to tell you a story about a conversation I had while I was on holiday in Italy last week. I went to a wonderful former bishop's palace near Padua. And having walked around this beautiful building, found my way to the cafe where there was wonderful wine being offered both to drink and for sale. And the enthusiast who was looking after the cafe was a guy called Giacomo. And so we started talking, and I started sampling some of his different offerings. And after he shared with me a delicious muscat wine, he said to me, you know, the trouble is that this vineyard has been winning awards for years, but now its major buyers have insisted that it goes organic, and it's stopped winning awards. And he said there's several problems. They don't seem to be able to adapt to not using the pesticides, but he said they also find that the form filling is so complicated, they have to employ an extra person to fill in the forms. And for a small business, that's really tough. Now, I'd like you to just keep that story in the back of your mind as we continue today's discussion, because what it made me reflect was, apart from anything else, do you get any credit in ESG for just being a well-run small business, which is by nature close to your community, or is it all obstacles? I'll leave that question with you for now, and let me now come on to the executive summary of what I'm going to be arguing today. Very simply, can ESG deliver? I think we need to be very clear about our concept, our theory of wealth creation, and I don't think ESG is. I think it's lost in a welter of confusion about the company's role. I think we also need to be clear about the way in which the whole investment chain works. I think we need to be clearer about the relationship between citizens, who are one end of the investment chain, and the professional shareholders who are at the other end. I think we need a systemic view in which we understand the role of government and how government too and regulation plays its part if we're going to have ESG deliver. And I think we need a much clearer priority on future generations. So with that summary in mind, I want to ask you to pause for a moment and just write in the chat how you define ESG. And Antoine has been pre-warned about this, and he's going to try and share anonymously some of your answers later on. I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds while you add your own definition of ESG.
You'll find a link in the chat box. I'll put it back again because I think many people are speaking. So it's at the bottom of the pile now. So to this link, you can put your own definition of ESG in a Google form that will remain anonymous, so everyone can express their views without fear of being quoted later. And I'll gather the answers and report them to you in due course during the meeting.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I'm going to continue now, and as I say here, this question actually takes me back, because it was in 2003 that Tomorrow's Company published a document which I wrote called Redefining Corporate Social Responsibility, Redefining CSR. And in that document, I did offer two alternative definitions of what was then the focus of so much discussion, corporate social responsibility. One of the two definitions which I offered, I called compliance corporate social responsibility. And I said in that paper that if compliance CSR became the dominant definition and the dominant way of thinking, we would end up with a kind of fashion parade in which companies would be somehow competing to say the right thing and metaphorically wear the right clothes. I was worried about CSR as a fashion parade. Equally, I felt that there were many people who were actually seeking to advocate conviction CSR. And the key to this is that the competition between companies is a competition in corporate personality. What do companies stand for? What is their character? Can they then go on from that to have a conversation with society in which society challenges them and says, are you actually living up to your claims about your character? That to me would have been the healthy one. So again, I'd like you to keep that in mind as we now come on to talking about ESG. ESG, of course, refers to a frame of reference of the investors, whereas CSR was talking about a frame of reference for companies. But clearly, in many ways, the assumptions and the thought processes are complementary.
And closing down your mics if you're not speaking. Thank you.
Thank you. And I've been arguing for some time. I did a blog a year ago which was entitled "ESG is an adjective, not a noun." In doing that blog, I went back to the history of ESG, and it was very interesting. Some of the people who'd been involved in a big Tomorrow's Company inquiry in 2000, which published in 2004, which was called Restoring Trust, Investment in the 21st Century, went on from there. They were part of the team that actually sat down with the UN Global Compact, and out of it came that opening conference. And notice, apart from the fact that they said it was going to be very important that you had the kind of mandatory reporting which enabled one to get companies to be rigorous about describing truthfully what they were doing in environment, social and governance terms. But notice this warning that they wanted to see it permeate the mainstream and that pigeonholing it would kill it. And I argued in the blog a year ago that I think ESG is becoming just what those pioneers have feared, which is a fashionable investment category. And of course, if you have something which is not well or consistently defined, that everybody talks about favorably because it reflects what they want it to mean, where you end up is that people who are annoyed by this start using terms like woke or political correctness to describe it. And there is some justification for their doing that because of the lack of rigor within the ESG movement, the lack of consistency in what we're saying. And we now have in the United States this extraordinary phenomenon where Republican politicians, even some of the slightly saner ones like Mike Pence, saying that ESG is just an extension of the political left. Now, very interestingly, one of the people who's been developing the whole thinking about ESG and mandatory reporting, for whom I have the greatest respect, is a man called Robert Eccles, and many of you may know Bob. He was actually somebody we talked to, and he was involved in some of the dialogues in the original Tomorrow's Company inquiry. He's been a professor at Harvard. He's been an investor himself. He helped to get the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board off the ground. He's been a great pioneer in trying to bring together those different wings of the whole sustainable ESG movement. The one wing which was more about the investor focus, and the one wing which was more about the societal focus. But it's interesting that at the beginning of this month, he actually sat down with a Republican called Daniel Crowley, because Bob is a Democrat, in an attempt to write a piece which is entitled "Turning Down the Heat on the ESG Debate," and saying to the political and the investment world, for goodness sake, let's not lose what's valuable about ESG by getting stuck in the crossfire between the warring political parties. And interestingly as well, and significantly, in that same piece, he now admits, while the terms sustainability and ESG mean very different things to different people. And he's clear that what it means to him is the subset of sustainability issues that matter to investors and are thus important to value creation. Now, this gets us into my first big worry about ESG, which is I don't think that its foundations are robust in terms of its assumptions about wealth creation. And first of all, this is because I think it almost entirely ignores entrepreneurship. Let me remind you of the great Joseph Schumpeter, and just invite you to read this wonderful, quite lyrical description of the entrepreneurial spirit. So this is Schumpeter talking about the vital contribution of the entrepreneur to society, and making it clear that people don't just start businesses because they want to create shareholder value. They start businesses for a whole series of motivations, from power to ego to desperation to creativity and so on. And we need to remind ourselves that if we're going to solve the societal problems that we face, and I've taken the example here of farming that gets back in harmony with nature, the people who are best placed to do it are entrepreneurs. And this is a lovely example which came to my attention when I was working on the book with Ong Boon Hui, Entrusted, about a multi-stakeholder initiative in India, which is very much social enterprise entrepreneurship at its best. And India too, and I think Mike mentioned Tata, reminds us that, I mean, some of the biggest, most force for good businesses started as small businesses, were started by entrepreneurs who had a vision for how their company was going to contribute to their country and their society. And my point here is I don't think that we have valued the nature of companies as a force for good in the way that we have thought about ESG. So how do we identify a well-led company? Well, years ago, getting on for 30 years ago now, when we started the Tomorrow's Company inquiry, we expressed it in this form. It starts with purpose and values. It needs to have a very clear model of how we're going to be successful. That's the basis of our measurement. It focuses upon key relationships. Which are the relationships by which we live and die? Which are the relationships from which we learn? And it talks about the license to operate, the informal license to operate society grants, not just the formal license to operate, which is offered by regulation. Compare and contrast that view of companies with what you get in ESG. The problem with ESG is the only place it deals at all with companies and a well-led company is the G. And of course, the G is usually I just Googled governance, and I Googled the PRI organization to see what came up. And what comes up as a view of governance, which is talking technically about very narrow issues, important issues, vital issues, issues which in many ways are symptomatic of the wider purpose and values and leadership and behaviors of a company, but are in no way a guide to how a company is led, how entrepreneurially it may be contributing to making a better society, whether it's a tiny wine producer in Italy or whether it's Tata Steel around the world. And going back to the Tomorrow's Company vision, we developed early in our thinking a whole suite of publications which were about what is good governance. If we take the definition of the inclusive company that we talked about in the 1990s, what is good governance? And we talked about the fact that you needed to have a very clear board mandate, so the board knew who they were serving and how they were going to behave. You needed to have a very clear focus on culture. You needed to have a clear definition of the role of the chair. There's the work we did on board nomination committees, where we learned a lot from Sweden, particularly, where there's very good collaboration between the owners and the investors on the one hand and the company on the other, so that the right board is put in place. There's a panoply of work on what good governance looks like, which I don't recognize in much of the discussions about the G of ESG. And the risk of all this then is that what we end up with is cultural car crashes, when we have all of these labels, and the one in which I'm going to talk about briefly is B Corp. I remember talking to the founders of B Corp in the United States in the very early days. Wonderful vision, a very important idea that a company could be a certified benefit corporation, that there would be a rigorous process by which society would know that if we were buying from this business, it had society's well-being in mind. And yet, we now recently have experienced the Brew Corp example, where the culture of this company has been revealed to be toxic. And I understand that when B Corp start to get interested in whether the BrewDog certification is justified or not, lawyers become involved. Now, the difficulty arises because the governance of culture has not been properly looked at. If you look at the definitions in B Corp of governance, they're interested in things like how, is there good diversity of membership of the board? They don't go into all the things for which there's been a literature for 20 years about, do we know that the processes in this business are designed to assure the board and the outside world that the things that the company says it stands for are practiced in all its relationships. And this leads one to ask the question, so why have we this confusion? Why is ESG become so remote from the fundamentals of a well-led and a well-governed and a well-owned company? And I would argue that a lot of the problem comes again from the use of loose and lazy terms, which, like shareholder primacy and stakeholder theory, and the attempt to set one against the other without really understanding that neither of them address the needs of a well-led or a well-owned company. And so often, as in the famous statement by the Business Roundtable, we're led to believe that, isn't it wonderful, the Business Roundtable's moved from being all about shareholder primacy to all about stakeholder theory. Well, if you read the stuff, they haven't actually. And anyway, the language of shareholder primacy and the language of stakeholder theory have, in my view, one thing in common. They are both about how you can extract something from a company. They are neither about how you build a company from its starting point as an entrepreneur through its maturity to a grown-up company with positive impacts, for which, in my view, there is no substitute for thinking about stewardship. In the stewardship view of the company, directors owe their duty to the company It's not a case of arguing about which shareholders or stakeholders are going to take most out of the company. The key is build a successful company on enduring terms, treat people right, create value for people in all of your relationships, and what will follow is value that you can distribute economically to shareholders and value that you can distribute socially and environmentally to other stakeholders. So I think we really need to clear our minds of the dangerous diversions that we've gone on in this fruitless argument between shareholder and stakeholder. So I've said enough about wealth creation. Briefly, I want to talk about, in a sense, a mirror image of that argument and talk about the role of investment. And Antoine, another 10 minutes, is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
So the role of investment. I think that stewardship is at its often demonstrated best when you look at enduring family businesses or family-initiated businesses in which families still have a strong stake. I talked earlier about Tata. The Credit Suisse index is a fascinating index which has been around for I think a couple of decades now, and has traced the financial performance of listed companies which can still be described as family businesses because of the dominant role still played by families. And you'll see that even since the pandemic, they're showing very healthy returns for family businesses. So if we are thinking now about the investor perspective on ESG, let's not lose sight of the importance of the stewardship I've been describing in the previous part of the conversation as a key to ESG success. Earlier, in all the work of Tomorrow's Company and all the stuff that I've written, I like to remind people of some of the studies which link what I would now call stewardship with long-term shareholder value. The famous Built to Last work of Collins and Porras, the less famous work of Funabashi in Japan, who goes back to some companies which have been around over 1,000 years, but the qualities that come out are very much the same qualities. The work of Arie de Hoos, who was asked by the chairman of Shell to do a study about long-lived companies and why they were long-lived companies, and a slightly different focus, but the work of Jim Stengel about the top 50 companies that have been organized around the ideal of improving people's lives. Jim Stengel has less, because of his time horizon, of the long-term aspects of stewardship. But nonetheless, all of them are pointing towards what in many ways is a common sense proposition, that if you want shareholder value over an enduring period of time, you need to focus upon purpose, on values, on relationships, and upon financial prudence, and indeed on balancing the short and long term. And if we then bring those principles to bear in terms of the way in which we think about the investors in our system, the people who are looking for ESG to deliver for them, surely there's a logic which goes, I'm a citizen who happens to be a saver, who happens to be an investor. What I want out of this system is something which delivers me robust returns over capable of paying my pension in ways that will help to invest in companies I wouldn't be ashamed of my granddaughter working in, and will help to invest in companies which won't have terribly negative effects upon my granddaughter and my grandson in the way that they're going to be living 20 years from now. That seems to me a pretty common sense expectation of what I might like out of the investment system and the stewardship value chain. And so are we getting that? Or is the sort of capitalism we're getting still looking more like this, where our emphasis predominantly is on short-term shareholder value, where we have a market failure in the system where the charges are much too high, where fund managers compete against each other to beat each other over much shorter time horizons, where we don't see sufficient focus upon the stewarding of companies, because even where ESG comes into play, the governance definition is so narrow, and we still see tremendous pressure from markets to do share buybacks. And I'd compare that view of capitalism with the view of capitalism which I would describe, and which Ong Boon-Hui and I describe in our book, as stewardship capitalism, which looks like this. Both of these, of course, are caricatures, that both of these are oversimplifications, but I hope you'll recognize something real in the simplifications. And I therefore invite you to think about the principles of stewardship and the definition of stewardship as we come back to re-examining the shortcomings of ESG, particularly of G. Because we define stewardship as the active and responsible management of entrusted resources now and in the longer term, so as to hand them on in better condition. And if we think of it like that, the governance and the stewardship of a company is not something that is entirely within the grasp of the board, and it is not something that is entirely within the grasp of the owners and shareholders. It has to be a joint activity. And I don't see anything in the definition of governance in the classic ESG definitions which does justice to this. And the whole work of Tomorrow's Company on stewardship over the last 10 years, much of which has now been reflected in the work of the UK's Financial Reporting Council, and to a lesser extent in some of the stewardship codes we've seen around the world, has been to emphasize this sense that there's this joint activity going on where, when it's done at its best, we make sure that listed companies, particularly private equity-owned companies and other companies and family business-owned companies and employee-owned companies, the principles are the same, but the operation is different. But we ensure that with listed companies that what we end up with is indeed a clear mandate for the board, where the board knows who's put them in place, the board knows why they've been put in place, and the board balance the long term and the short term. That's planting for the future. The board, yes, focus very much upon performance today and the need to change the management if the performance is not adequate today, but not performance today at the expense of tomorrow. And they focus in setting the course upon purpose, values and behaviors, and they focus in risk management and in their scenarios and so on, and in all of their stakeholder relationships in the way that they sense and shape the future. That is stewardship, and that to me is the foundations for the effective governance of a business. So finally, I've talked about wealth creation, I've talked about the role of investment. There isn't time to talk in any detail about the role of government and the way in which we prioritize the needs of future generations. But let me just say briefly this on the role of government. And we say much more in Trusted. It's extraordinary to me that we have regulation. If we look in the UK, for example, at the terms of reference of the Financial Conduct Authority, the Ofwat, the water regulator, and in the UK, there's huge scandal at the moment about the amount of sewage that's being discharged into rivers and so on. And if we look at Ofgem, which is the regulator that is responsible for energy generation, and that's a huge crisis at the moment, in none of those regulators' terms of reference do I read that their focus needs to encompass serving the needs of future generations. These terms of reference have very much been written by liberal economists who worry about price competition and price disclosure, and future generations are barely a footnote. And that, it seems to me, is a huge weakness which the government needs to address. Of course, in the UK, there's been a lot of work done on company law. I believe Philip Goldenberg, who worked as the company lawyer of the original Tomorrow's Company inquiry, is in the room, virtual room, and the work that was done there to make sure that Section 172 focused directors' duties on the company. There's now an argument, of course, about whether a better business act is needed, and I'll leave that for Q&A or another day. But the role of government also, surely, the government as a steward should be thinking about its budget, the 300 to 400 billion that the government spends through the public sector. Why isn't the government saying, we have a concept of a well-led, well-governed company, and all of our purchasing is going to have criteria in it that encourages purchasing from companies which meet those criteria. Through the efforts of Tomorrow's Company, there is now a British standard which actually reflects those criteria and is available for government to use. And in the years to come, Tomorrow's Company is working very hard to persuade governments to take up BS 95009 so that we have governments as better purchasers. And a lot more of that is captured in Trusted, where we talk, as you see here, about a rounded view of how stewardship can influence government policy and indeed the role of consumers. So, in conclusion, these, it seems to me, are the problems that ESG faces. And to me, the pyramid needs to be introduced that looks like this. G, or an extended version of G at the top of the pyramid, before we even start thinking about positive social impact and climate and biodiversity impact, we've got to know that the companies that we're choosing to invest in are well-led, are well-owned, do satisfy some kind of definition of stewardship, because otherwise we get into the brewdog syndrome. So it seems to me we need a broader definition of G, and we need the definition of G to be a prior stage in the operations of ESG, if indeed we're to guide investors widely. And so as I leave you to challenge what I've been saying, let me leave you with what I would describe, and originally described in something I wrote in 2002, which is called Lessons from Enron, with a much more human, a much more relationship-focused, a much more systemic view of what governance is all about.
Could you leave the last slide a little bit longer?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Just back up a little.
I didn't mean to lose it, and I will do my best to get it back. Have I lost the screen sharing? There we go. Yeah, it's coming back in a minute. Hold on, here it is. Is that back?
Thank you. Yes. Yes. I think we didn't have time to read it all.
I beg your pardon.